Because the Nicaraguan government does not fulfill its responsibility of ensuring that the constitutional rights of its citizens are protected, such as freedom of speech and press, a dictatorship is able to hide behind a facade of democracy. For much of its existence as an independent country, Nicaragua's growth has been hindered by internal conflict, corruption, and violations of human rights. Nicaragua was ruled by the Somoza family dictatorship from 1936 to 1979. Under the corrupt dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza after the U.S. occupation of Nicaragua ended, people saw their rights infringed. Those who spoke against the authoritarian ruler were especially brutalized. A socialist group called the Sandinista National Liberation Front, known as the FSLN for short, sparked an uprising and overthrew the Somoza dictatorship in the Nicaraguan Revolution of 1979. When the new government, led by Daniel Ortega, began supporting both socialism and international terrorists, Ronald Reagan condemned the Sandinistas and refused to send them aid. Their close ties with the communist countries of Cuba and the Soviet Union further strained relations between the United States and Nicaragua. As a result, the CIA trained and supplied a rebel group called the Contras, who were fighting against the Sandinistas. The Contra War, as was known, was characterized by the atrocities both sides committed against civilians and prisoners. In 1988, after 8 years of fighting, torture, kidnappings, and executions, the Sandinistas and the Contras reached a ceasefire. The Sandinistas remained the dominant political party after the war, with Daniel Ortega as president until he was defeated in the election of 1990. After losing the next two elections, they succeeded in restoring Daniel Ortega as president of Nicaragua in 2006, and he currently remains in power. His questionable victory in the flawed election of 2011, however, demonstrates that even in the 21st century, Nicaragua is still struggling to overcome problems from the past. While the Nicaraguan Constitution guarantees its citizens the freedom of speech and press, these rights are not respected and practiced by the government and the Nicaraguan National Police. The government cannot exercise censorship, but the fact that speaking against the Sandinistas can bring criminal defamation charges causes many people to practice self-censorship. Radio stations, television networks, and newspapers are the main sources of information for Nicaraguans. All have been heavily influenced by the Sandinistas in order to preserve their dominance and support from the people. Journalists often receive death threats and have even been killed by the supporters of the party for reporting on corruption and other similar topics that criticize the FSLN-controlled government. All citizens are granted the right to a fair and impartial trial, but the corrupt judiciary severely hampers this. Under the law, courts are supposed to be fair and independent. In reality, they can be bribed or politicized and maintain close connections with the Sandinistas. According to the Latin Barometro survey in 2011, only 40% of Nicaraguans were satisfied with the judicial system. Judges are appointed based on their political affiliations, and as a result, their biased rulings reflect this. Trials are frequently delayed for long periods of time, and courts in rural areas are inadequate. The mediocrity of the judicial system was shown in 2011 during the trial of Jason Purical, an American arrested under the notion that he was involved in the drug trade. Even after multiple searches of his home in Nicaragua by the police, no evidence was found. His own mother was prevented from testifying for him. Although irrefutable evidence was never produced, Purical received a 22-year sentence from a judge, whose lawyers claimed to be an unlicensed attorney. Inhumane treatment and torture by the government, especially the police, plagues Nicaragua. In 2002, the Nicaraguan Center for Human Rights received 293 cases of inhumane treatment by the police, yet only 72 police officers lost their jobs, with many facing short suspensions and no punishment at all. Officers are known for using excessive force and unwarranted arrests. Because President Daniel Ortega controls the police, they sympathize Sandinista supporters over opponents. Since police officers also have no fear of higher authority, they are corrupt and readily accept bribes. Although Nicaragua has all the institutions it needs to protect human rights, they are ineffective due to corruption. With few to challenge the amount of control President Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas have over the country, one could say that Nicaragua is already under a dictatorship. Because the Nicaraguan government does not fulfill its responsibility of ensuring that the constitutional rights of its citizens are protected, such as freedom of speech and press, an authoritarian rule is able to hide behind a facade of democracy. According to John Locke, the father of classic liberalism, a government that functions as a democracy is bound to a social contract with its citizens. In exchange for the consent to rule, they promise to govern by the will of the people and ensure that their natural rights of life, liberty, and property are protected. Because Nicaragua is a democratic country, it is the government's responsibility to uphold this social contract. This responsibility is also bestowed upon them by their constitution and international agreements. However, even with such measures in place, the Nicaraguan government fails to fulfill its duty of protecting its citizens and serving justice to those who violate human rights. The suppression of liberties makes it difficult for Nicaraguans to voice their opinions against the Sandinista-controlled government. This is because there is a constant fear of persecution and retaliation by the president's supporters. As a result, the government runs with the consent of only part of the population instead of the whole. By not protecting the right of the Nicaraguan people to publicly oppose the government, President Ortega is ensuring that only his supporters can be heard. The National Assembly, which is Nicaragua's legislative body, is dominated by a supermajority of Sandinista supporters. 63 out of the 92 representatives pledge allegiance to Ortega. Political minorities are powerless. Whether the people who support him do so out of pride or from fear, they give President Ortega almost total control of the government. While the Nicaraguan government recognizes itself as a democracy, Ortega's actions in office have moved him closer to a dictator than a president. He has illegally replaced mayors elected by the people with his supporters and has been accused of rigging elections, to name a few. Ortega takes advantage of his enormous public support, corruption in the government, and the partisan nature of the Supreme Court to push the agenda forward. Previously, running for more than 2 terms as president was unconstitutional. However, on January 29, 2014, the Nicaraguan Constitution was amended to remove these limits. Now Ortega can and will run for a 3rd term in the upcoming election of 2016. Critics of this move say it was designed to keep the Sandinista leader in power for life. It was already difficult for the Nicaraguan people to exercise their right to change the government. With President Daniel Ortega gaining more and more control over the country, it has become nearly impossible for change to come about. A mass struggle like the Nicaraguan Revolution that freed the country from the Somoza dictatorship in 1979 may eventually be the only way to remove Ortega from power. Despite the fact that Nicaragua is essentially under a dictatorship, the government strives to maintain the appearance of a democracy by using elections, a legislative assembly, and courts. The Nicaraguan government continues to maintain the facade of democracy for both political and economic reasons. Currently, Nicaragua receives hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign aid from both the United States and the European Union. If Nicaragua were to commit to a full-fledged dictatorship, the US and the EU would terminate their support. In fact, $190 million in aid was suspended due to Nicaragua's weakening democracy and ignored human rights situation. Nicaragua is already one of the poorest countries in Latin America. Losing foreign aid would devastate the country. In terms of politics, the United States could intervene with Nicaraguan affairs if the international superpower believes a dictatorship is in place. In this interview, Ortega explains how the United States is still the imperialistic aggressor it was years ago.
The only thing we see is that the U.S. hasn't changed in its essence. The world is changing, the U.S. isn't. This isn't a problem just for Latin America, but rather for the entire world. This country has military and economic power, and at the same time, it's not changing its expansionary and imperialistic policy.
Do you mean that so far change has happened only in words, not in deeds?
That's right. They carry on the same policy as always. They've been acting just like in the past. Their policy is of unwelcome intervention, of coups and threats. It's so-called policy of carrots and sticks.
The United States has a history of interfering in countries where democracy is threatened. Nicaragua was no exception. During the Contra War in the 1980s, the United States supported the overthrow of Nicaragua's government because it leaned towards socialism. In addition, the Monroe Doctrine was used to justify their intervention in Latin American countries. By maintaining the appearance that they are a democratic country, following the same principles as the United States, there will be no reason for the U.S. to intervene as it had in the past. The mark of an effective democratic government is one that can protect the rights of its citizens, not infringe them. President Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas are perfectly comfortable ignoring the rule of law in order to preserve their control. Dictators that do not come by force come by finesse. That is just what Ortega is doing, gradually siphoning power from the people to himself. The situation in Nicaragua is largely ignored by the international community. If the world continues to turn a blind eye to this seemingly democratic country, Nicaragua will be plunged into the tyranny not of Ortega the president, but of Ortega the dictator.